This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight, we unearth a story buried for more than a century, a tragedy captured in a photograph, and a truth that should have stayed hidden beneath the soil. In Victorian England, death was not the end. It was a ritual, a performance, a final portrait. When the last breath left the body, families would summon the photographer not to capture the living, but to preserve the dead. These were called memento mori, tokens of remembrance for those who could no longer speak. But some photographs hold more than memory. Some hold evidence. The story begins on November 15th, 1858, inside a modest London home filled with silence and mourning. The Prescott family had just suffered a terrible loss. 16-year-old Herbert Prescott, eldest son, brother, and the fragile pillar of what remained of his family, was dead. The photograph that would immortalize him was meant to be a farewell. Instead, it became the most haunting clue in one of Victorian medicine's most disturbing mysteries. At the time of his death, Herbert was a healthy young man, intelligent, disciplined, mature beyond his years. His father had died 3 years earlier in a carriage accident, leaving Herbert to care for his fragile mother, Victoria, and his younger brother, George, who was only 9. In a home filled with grief, Herbert had become both brother and father figure, the one who held the pieces together. On the morning of November 14th, everything seemed ordinary. Herbert woke early, ate breakfast, spoke briefly with George about the coming winter, then excused himself, saying he felt slightly tired. There was nothing unusual in his tone, nothing to suggest that those words would be his last. By nightfall, when he failed to come down for dinner, George climbed the stairs, expecting to find his brother asleep. What he found instead was the beginning of a lifelong nightmare. Herbert was lying on his bed, still, his face calm, as though he were lost in an unbroken dream. His skin had cooled, his chest did not rise, and when the doctor arrived, his verdict was swift. Dr. Frederick Hastings, a man respected in the neighborhood, trained in Edinburgh, examined Herbert carefully. No wounds, no fever, no signs of poisoning. The heart had stopped, yes, but without cause. A death without reason, he wrote. A sudden death by indeterminate natural cause. In the language of the era, that meant one thing: the limits of medicine had been reached. The family was told to bury him within 48 hours. Such was the law of hygiene, and perhaps of mercy. Victoria Prescott, weakened by grief, could barely stand. The arrangements fell instead to a family friend, James Morland, a local photographer known for his delicate post-mortem portraits. It was he who proposed the idea of a photograph. "It may help you remember him as he was," he said softly, setting down his heavy camera case. The following morning, November the 15th, Morland prepared the room, curtains drawn to dim the light, the air heavy with silence. Herbert's body was placed in his favorite armchair, dressed in his best suit, as if awaiting a final conversation. Little George stood beside him, one trembling hand resting on his brother's shoulder. The camera's eye opened for several long minutes, capturing the two brothers in stillness, one living, one forever paused, between life and death. Morland's notes from that day would not be discovered until decades later. In his tidy handwriting, he recorded an odd observation. The subject appeared to retain a faint coloration in the cheeks, unlike the usual pallor of the deceased. I attributed it to the freshness of the body. It was a detail no one questioned then, but it would haunt generations to come. Herbert was buried the next day in the parish cemetery. The coffin was oak, simple, sealed with care. Neighbors attended the funeral. The priest spoke of peace, of the brevity of youth, of the mysteries of God. And when the final clod of earth fell, the boy who had once been the strength of his family disappeared into the soil. Life went on, as it always must. Victoria withdrew into her mourning, retreating deeper into silence. George, now the only son, grew up surrounded by whispers and shadows. The photograph framed and placed in the parlor became the family's relic, a window to a brother lost but never forgotten. Years passed, decades. The photograph outlived them all. George grew into a man, a husband, a father, and finally, an old man with trembling hands who still spoke softly to his brother's image. When he died in 1923, his children inherited that framed photograph and the story that came with it. They would never know how deeply its shadows reached. Because in 1919, 4 years before George's death, the ground itself had begun to speak. That year, workmen were exhuming graves to make room for the fallen soldiers of the Great War. The old Prescott plot was among them. A forensic specialist, Dr. Horace Fairchild, was overseeing the exhumations. He was a man of science trained in France, curious, methodical, and unafraid of what he might find beneath the earth. When the coffin of Herbert Prescott was lifted into the light after 61 years underground, Fairchild noted something strange. The wood had decayed, yes, but the lid showed faint marks, irregular, too deliberate to be the work of worms. He ordered it opened. Inside lay the skeleton of a boy who had not died peacefully. The arms were no longer crossed over the chest. They were raised, clawing toward the coffin lid. The fingernails had splintered against the wood. The bones of the fingers were fractured, twisted outward. The lid itself was gouged with deep scratches, desperate human scratches. The boy had woken. Fairchild's report, preserved today in the archives of the Royal Institute of Medicine, describes the horror in clinical language. But between the lines, the truth screams louder than any words. Herbert Prescott had been buried alive. He had entered a state the Victorians called suspended animation, what we now know as catalepsy, a rare neurological condition that mimics death so perfectly that even trained physicians cannot tell the difference. The body stiffens, the breath slows, the pulse weakens until it is undetectable by touch. The mind remains trapped inside, conscious, aware, but paralyzed. A waking death. And when that coffin closed, Herbert Prescott lay in silence, unable to move, unable to cry out, listening to the sound of his own burial. How long he survived inside, no one will ever know. Hours, perhaps. Long enough for oxygen to fade, for panic to take hold, for his body to tear itself apart in the dark. Fairchild's notes mention the fractures at the base of the skull, a result, he concluded, of extreme internal pressure caused by fear and suffocation. It is one thing to imagine death. It is another to imagine being conscious through it. The truth, when it surfaced, turned what was once a sentimental photograph into something else entirely. That serene face, captured in 1858, was not the face of the dead. It was the face of someone on the very edge of life, the final moment before the coffin. When experts later examined the photograph with modern methods, they saw what James Morland had noticed but could not understand: the faint color in Herbert's cheeks, the tension at the corners of his mouth, the eyelids not fully closed. Signs of circulation, signs of life. And in that photograph, George's hand resting on his brother's shoulder takes on a new, chilling meaning, not a gesture of farewell, but of contact. One living, one almost still alive. The Prescott photograph became more than art. It became evidence. Proof of how fragile life's boundary once was, and how easily science could mistake the living for the dead. After the report was published, whispers began to circulate through the medical halls of London. Doctors who had once dismissed superstition now found themselves confronted by a truth more terrifying than myth. The idea that a man could be declared dead and yet be alive, breathing faintly beneath the soil, haunted the Victorian imagination like a ghost that could never rest. It was not the first such case, but it was, perhaps, the most undeniable. Dr. Horace Fairchild's detailed documentation of Herbert Prescott's body, the claw marks, the fractures, the desperate final position, became a subject of forensic lectures across Europe. The case made its way into the pages of The Lancet under a cautious title, A Study of Posthumous Displacement and Erroneous Diagnosis of Death. But among physicians, it was known by a different name. They called it The Boy Who Woke in the Dark. For the public, the story was unbearable, and yet impossible to ignore. Newspapers softened the details, printing only that a possible medical error had been discovered upon exhumation. But the rumors filled in what the ink would not. People said they could hear scratching in their dreams, that the wind itself carried the echo of fingernails against wood. For a society obsessed with decorum and death, the case struck at the heart of everything they believed about control. Victorians had turned dying into ceremony, the polished casket, the black drapery, the solemn ritual of farewell. Now, all that ceremony felt like a trap. The Prescotts had followed every rule, every protocol, every gesture of respect, and yet they had buried their son alive. Doctors began re-examining the bodies of those declared dead too quickly and found that the mistake was not as rare as they had hoped. The term suspended animation entered the public vocabulary. Medical journals began to discuss new methods of confirming death waiting periods, mirror tests to detect the faintest breath, pressure on the skin to observe color return. But all of this came too late for Herbert Prescott. James Morland, the photographer, lived to see the story spread. His own notes, the ones found years later in his studio, reveal a quiet torment. In a letter to a colleague, he confessed, "I have photographed many corpses. None have looked so alive. I remember the child's unease, the way he kept glancing toward his brother's face, whispering softly between each exposure. At the time, I thought it was grief. Now I'm not so certain." That letter, dated 1860, would not be read until after Morland's death. By then, his glass negatives had already begun to decay, the silver salts corroding into abstract shapes as if the image itself refused to be remembered. George Prescott, the boy in the photograph, never learned the truth. He lived an ordinary life, married, raised children, and died believing his brother had gone peacefully. But in his journals, discovered much later, a few sentences stand out like a wound in the paper. "Sometimes I dream of Herbert. I hear him calling me. Mother says it is only the imagination of a child, but in my dreams he does not look dead. He looks afraid." Those dreams, those childhood fears, would later become the most tragic kind of prophecy. After Dr. Fairchild's report was made public, the medical community began to study similar cases, and the results were horrifying. Across Britain and continental Europe, dozens of exhumations revealed the same evidence. Bodies twisted from their burial position, nails splintered, bones fractured from desperate attempts to escape. In some coffins, the inner lining was shredded. In others, the dead had managed to turn completely over before suffocating. The Victorians, who had prided themselves on logic and progress, were forced to confront the possibility that hundreds, perhaps thousands, had been buried alive. Panic followed. Families began demanding proof that their loved ones were truly dead. Doctors were harassed in the streets, accused of negligence, even murder. And from this hysteria, a new industry was born: the safety coffin. In the years that followed, advertisements began appearing in London newspapers. Bateson's patent coffin with bell attachment. Guaranteed means of communication from below. For a price, grieving families could now purchase peace of mind. These coffins were fitted with small tubes for air, mirrors to reflect movement, and bells connected to ropes tied around the deceased's wrists. If the dead awoke, they could ring for help. Historians would later record that in several cemeteries, faint rings were indeed reported during the night. Whether they were caused by settling earth, rodents, or something else no one could say. But the sound was enough to make the living shudder. Not all safety devices were successful. Many failed in their design. Others were abandoned by cemetery keepers who found the constant ringing unbearable. Yet, the very existence of these inventions revealed the depth of the fear Herbert Prescott's story had awakened. And while public fascination eventually faded, the case lived on, not in whispers this time, but in laboratories. Decades later, as medical science advanced, Herbert's case became a cornerstone in the study of catalepsy, a neurological state of apparent death marked by muscular rigidity and suspended breathing. Researchers realized that in the 19th century, such episodes could last hours or even days. In an age without modern instruments, the line between life and death was not simply thin, it was invisible. Modern physicians, examining Dr. Hastings's original notes, the very doctor who certified Herbert dead, confirmed what Fairchild had suspected. The signs he described were classic cataleptic symptoms: shallow breathing, muscular stiffness, no visible pulse. By the standards of 1858, Hastings had done everything right, and yet everything wrong. The tragedy of the Prescott case lies not in cruelty, but in ignorance, in the arrogance of an era that believed it had mastered death. Herbert Prescott was one of many victims of medicine's learning curve, a bridge between faith and science, sacrificed to the limits of his time. But what makes his story linger isn't just the horror of his end. It's the photograph. That single moment, captured in silence, preserving the illusion of peace when the truth was anything but. Even now, historians and forensic specialists study the image, searching for clues hidden in the grain of old silver. They note the tension in the jawline, the slight lift of the eyelid, the unnatural posture of the hand signs, overlooked by Victorians, but unmistakable to modern eyes. The image has become an artifact of transition between life and death, faith and reason, ignorance and knowledge. And though more than a century has passed, the lesson remains the same. The body may lie still, but the truth never rests. When visitors to medical museums today pass the framed reproduction of the Prescott photograph, few realize the enormity of what they're seeing. They see an old portrait of grief. They don't hear the silence behind it. The silence of dirt pressing against wood. The silence of breath running out. The silence of a boy who woke too late. By the dawn of the 20th century, Herbert Prescott had become more than a story. He had become a warning. His name was whispered in medical schools, dissected in journals, and adapted in fiction under other names. But no matter how many times the story was retold, it always carried the same chill, that the grave was not always the end. Victorian England had long believed in the certainty of ritual. Death was supposed to follow rules: the doctor's signature, the priest's blessing, the coffin's seal. But when Herbert's case came to light, those rules began to crack. Writers, already fascinated by the threshold between life and death, found new inspiration in the horror of mistaken burial. Edgar Allan Poe's The Premature Burial, published only a few years before Herbert's death, now read less like imagination and more like prophecy. And as the century turned, that fear became a cultural obsession. Stage plays, penny dreadfuls, and serialized novels filled with scenes of hands breaking through dirt, of bells ringing in the dark, of sleepers who could not die. Yet beneath the sensationalism was something quieter, a reflection of the human fear that science, for all its progress, could not protect us from the unknown. The Victorians had conquered disease, invented the telegraph, crossed oceans, but death still mocked them. Doctors responded by creating entire societies devoted to the study of signs of death. Hospitals began delaying burials. Coroners demanded more rigorous confirmation of demise. The line between medicine and superstition blurred once more. And in that uncertain twilight, the story of Herbert Prescott continued to echo. The Prescott photograph became a teaching tool. Students were shown the image and asked, "How would you know if he were truly dead?" There was no answer that satisfied everyone. It was in this confusion that a new generation of scientists turned to technology for clarity. By the mid-1900s, machines could measure the faintest pulse, detect the smallest breath. Yet even then, cases of apparent death, misdiagnosed comas, deep hypothermia, catatonic states persisted. The line was clearer now, but not gone. And so, Herbert's legacy lived on in a quiet, relentless way every time a doctor checked twice before signing a certificate, every time a nurse watched for one more heartbeat, just to be sure. There is an irony in this, that a boy who never knew fame in life became the guardian of the dead in death. But history, like the human mind, has layers, and beneath the medical legacy of Herbert Prescott lies something far older, the primal terror that still stirs in us when we imagine being buried alive. That fear never truly vanished. It just changed its shape. In the decades that followed, psychologists began to recognize this phobia as something deeper than cultural superstition. It was the fear of losing control, of awareness, trapped inside helplessness. It became a symbol for the fragility of consciousness itself, how easily it could slip, how thin the veil between waking and oblivion really is. Even today, when someone wakes in the middle of the night with their heart racing, unable to move, unable to speak, they call it sleep paralysis. Science has its explanation. But somewhere in that frozen terror, that invisible weight pressing against the chest, lies the echo of an older fear, the same fear that took Herbert Prescott's last breath. Victorian England may have passed into history, but its ghosts remain in the medical instruments preserved in glass cases, in the faded photographs of families trying to smile beside the dead, and in the questions that never stop haunting us. What if the line between life and death is not a line at all, but a slow fading of the same candle? What if the body knows the truth long before the mind accepts it? And what if, even now, there are moments when the world mistakes the living for the dead? There are cemeteries across Europe where the soil has shifted in strange ways. Old graves where the earth above seems disturbed, though no storms or floods have passed through. Caretakers sometimes speak of it quietly, half in jest, half in fear. They say the ground never truly settles around those who weren't ready to rest. In one such cemetery, in London's Eastern Quarter, an unmarked headstone still stands where the Prescott family once lay. The inscription has worn away. No name, no date, only a faint engraving, barely visible in the stone, a single word remembered. Those who visit say the air there feels colder than the rest of the graveyard. Perhaps it's just imagination. Or perhaps some part of the story still lingers, still watching, still waiting to be understood. The photograph itself, now preserved in the Royal Medical Archive, is kept in a temperature-controlled vault. No one touches it without gloves. The glass is cracked, the image faint, the eyes nearly faded. Yet if you look close enough to see the grain, the blur of time, you might feel it. That slight tension in the face, that almost living stillness. A face on the border between breath and silence. And that is the power of the story, not that it shocks us, but that it reminds us of what we forget too easily. That death is not an event. It is a transition. And sometimes that transition does not go as we expect. This was Deep Night Whispers. And tonight, the night has reminded us, there are things that were never meant to wake.